Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning and great day, everyone. Welcome to our Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities Professor Lecture Series. And today it will be our 13th series. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for your continuous support and feedback. Ladies and gentlemen, I would humbly request if you could invite your friends, colleague, family to join us. I will appreciate if you could also like our Facebook, share our Facebook, and subscribe our YouTube channel. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start our program, I would like to invite our beloved Dean, Professor Dr. Zaidatun Taseh, to give her welcoming speech. Please welcome, Prof.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you, Dr. Rostam, and for the welcoming. Okay, of course, we have today our FSSH Adjunct Professor Lecture Series 13. Welcome to everybody who joined us through Facebook and also through YouTube's. And of course, we have our prominent speaker, Yang Berbahagia Datuk Dr. Habibah Abdul Rahim, the former Director General of Education, Ministry of Education Malaysia, and today's titles is very significant and very relevant to our situation since we face COVID-19 pandemic since last year, the leadership in times of crisis, the reflections of the former Director Generals of Education. As we know that COVID-19 pandemic has struck our nations and the world since 2020, and leadership, crisis in leadership is one of the important factors that have been affected because of the pandemics. And one of the most consistent elements of the crisis of leadership appear to be the sense making in the condition of uncertainty. I remember last year in 2020 at UTM, we are facing the same problem, the COVID-19 pandemic. When it struck 17 March 2020 is the date that we are having our first MCO, where at that moment in UTM we are having our 6 weeks of lecture, where automatically we have to change our teaching and learning to the online learning. And of course, within that 2 weeks of MCO, we are quite blessing also we have a 2 weeks of MCO, because during that 2 weeks of MCO, that is where the leaders in UTM, we sat together and try to think how we're going to move on. Although some of us thought that during that 2 weeks of MCO, some of us saying that we are having a holiday, but the leaders at the institution, including at school, we are sat together every hours to try to think on how we're going to tackle this COVID-19 pandemic. Because after 2 weeks after that, okay, we should actually continue the teaching and learning, regardless of using any means that we have. And I still remember, okay, 1st of April is a date that UTM launched and started our online learning to all of our students, because we believe that we cannot delay it anymore. So this is the uncertainty, the condition of uncertainty that needs judgment, creativity, and I believe guts also among the leaders to decide on something, to take a risk on any decision that we decide at that moment. So this is where I think today's topic is very important topic for us to recall back last year, and today's topic is based on the perspective of what happened at school, where we are parents, that we believe that we would like to know also in terms of leadership crisis and how the Ministry of Education able to tackle the condition of COVID-19 pandemic. I believe congratulations to the Ministry of Education, kudos to the MOE, and to all the teachers, the leaders at any levels under the Ministry of Education, because we believe that SPM took place and the result has been come up really, I think, good for everybody. And this is where, although the COVID-19 pandemic struck the nation, it did not actually what we call it major effect, give a major impact or effect to the conditions of our schools and also the university. Life goes on, and this is where we would like to hear on the experience from Yang Berbahagia Datuk Dr Habibah, based on her experience as a former Director General of Education during the difficult and challenging times last year. So thank you again, Yang Berbahagia Datuk, for accepting our invitations to deliver your experience in today's session. And of course, thank you very much also to the Chair of School of Education, Prof. Fatin Aliyah Pang, and to the moderator for today's Associate Professor Dr. Azlina Muhammad Kosnin, our Deputy Deans of Academic and Student Affairs, and to the MC Dr. Muhammad Rostam bin Muhammad Ramli, and to all the technical teams who actually assist to make sure that today program will be successful. So, and also to our audience at YouTube and Facebook, thank you for your support. And this is not going to be, I think, the last adjunct professors by Yang Berbahagia Datuk, inshallah in the future. And also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, next week we're going to have another adjunct professor lecture by Dr. Freda, and this is where that the way that university, especially UTM, specifically Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, our contribution to share our experience from the experts to all the audience out there. So thank you very much. With that, I end my speech with Wabillahi taufiq wa hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Dr. Zaidatun, for the welcoming speech. Ladies and gentlemen, our today's topic for the lecture series is on leadership in time of crisis, reflections of the former Director General of Education, which will be delivered by Yang Berbahagia Datuk Dr. Habibah Abdul Rahim, our former Director General of Education, Ministry of Education, Malaysia. So, without further ado, I would like to welcome Moderator, Associate Professor Dr. Azlina Muhammad Kosnin, Deputy Dean of Academic Students Affairs, Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities, UTM, to moderate this event. Please welcome Associate Professor Dr. Azlina.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you so much, Dr. Rostam. Welcome everybody, ladies and gentlemen, for our 13th series of the FSSH Adjunct Professor Lecture Series. And we are very fortunate today because we're going to have Dr. Habibah again for our 13th series. And this is her 4th lecture at FSSH UTM as our adjunct professor. And today's topic is very interesting because this is something which is related to everyone, which is leadership in times of crisis, a reflection of the former Director General of Education, which is Dr. Habibah herself. Okay, Datuk Habibah, I think requires no further introduction who she is. Everybody knows who she is, but I would like to highlight her glorious professional background as an inspiration to all of us. Datuk Habibah started her service in education in 1986 as a teacher in several schools in Selangor and Kedah before leaving to serve under several organizations under the ministry. Among her positions were the Deputy Director General for Policy and Curriculum Sector, Education Planning and Research Division Director, Performance and Delivery Unit PADU, Executive Director, and Senior Lecturer at IAB or Institute Aminuddin Baki. Dr. Habibah also furthered her studies in education at University of Bristol, United Kingdom, and her PhD in education from Stanford University, United States. She was the Education Director General effective from the 10th of January 2020 until 6th of April 2021, in which she recently retired. And she was actually the 17th Director General and the second woman to helm the post. She's currently a senior fellow at Institute Masa Negara or Masa Depan Negara or MASA. We can see that she has gone through various levels of positions in the education system as practitioners, as well as the top leader in the Ministry of Education as the Education Director General itself. So you can see that she has a lot of experiences in our education system from various angles of the implementation of education, specifically in Malaysia. So when we were hit first by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, Unfortunately or fortunately for Dr. Habibah, she was the leader at that time, and she had to she didn't foresee this, and she had to endure what were the things that happened at that time. Okay, so today's topic is very much on to reflecting what she had experienced in those challenges during the crisis, and how the education ministry overcome those challenges. And actually we are still having this crisis, and we are very much into the crisis still, but we have been in this situation for quite some time, in which we are more prepared as compared to when Dr. Habibah was leading the ministry at that time. We were not prepared at all. It came in as a surprise. So there must be a lot of challenges in which the ministry, specifically Dr. Habibah, had to face and had to overcome at that time. So we are very fortunate today for having her to share her experiences, what she had undergone through those phases. Okay, is the slide ready, technical team? Datuk Habibah, how are you, Datuk?
Alhamdulillah. Thank you.
Okay, I think we are still waiting for the slide to be prepared. Okay, can the team prepare the slide for Dr. Habibah to start her lecture? So ladies and gentlemen, just bear with us for a while. Okay, so okay, Datuk, your slide is ready. Without further ado, I would like to invite Datuk Dr. Habibah to deliver her lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Zaratul Tasmin, Dean FSSH, Professor Dr. Azlina, our MC, Dr. Muhammad Rostam, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the introduction. I think the last session that I had for this lecture series, I also spoke about leadership in times of crisis. But at that time, my focus was more on the COVID-19 crisis as creating VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and how leadership at various levels should also handle this VUCA situation with VUCA as well. But this time around, I've been asked to share some of my experiences during my tenure as the Director General of Education. I think in the introduction, it was mentioned that I started my career in 1986. So I have more than 34 years in education. But as
sorry, Datuk, excuse me. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. Datuk, can you share the slide for us? Because I think there's a bit of miscommunication in terms of who's handling the slide. I think
it's already. I have already on the slide.
Can you start sharing it? Just bear with us, ladies and gentlemen. We are having a little glitch here. It's not that big glitch, but we are waiting for the slide to be on the screen at the moment.
Can you see it?
Yes, Datuk. Yeah, just
Okay.
make it bigger slideshow.
Yeah, it is on slideshow.
We cannot see it as a slideshow. Okay, I think you can just continue, Datuk. We can still see the content. Okay, thank you,
Okay.
Datuk. Carry on.
All right. So my tenure as the Director General of Education was from 10th of January last year until the 6th of April this year. So it's about 1 year, 3 months. Among various questions that has been raised to me is that I have been appointed at a very challenging time. So what has been some of those challenges or hurdles that I have faced? So I think I would like to focus on 3 of them. The first challenge is that the changes that were happening in the leadership at the highest level and at the Ministry of Education itself. So when the former Director General of Education retired in December 2019, I took over the duties of the KPPM then, beginning 21st of December 2019. So from there on, I think there were rapid changes in the political scenario and the government leadership. So within less than 4 months, we had 4 ministers of education, including 2 prime ministers at that time. So we started with YB Dr. Mazli Malik, but come January 2020, he already resigned, and we had Yang Amat Berhormat Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, who was the Prime Minister then, also acting as the Minister of Education. So by mid-January, we already had a briefing with Tun, and in February, he delivered his amanat as well as his aspirations regarding the education system. Nevertheless, and that was also the time where I gave my inaugural speech as the KPPM, because it usually comes after the Minister of Education delivers the minister's speech. So I gave my speech then. But come March, when I had to brief the Minister of Education on the SPM results for 2019, I was already briefing Yang Amat Berhormat Tan Sri Mahidin Yassin. So there's a change there as well. And later, after that briefing and SPM result came out, just before COVID-19 hit us, we were already starting to brief a new Minister of Education, which is YB Datuk Dr. Razzie Jidin. So in about 4 months, we already had 4 Ministers of Education, including 2 Prime Ministers. So what does this mean to the leadership and to the education system? I think as civil servants, we had to support the leadership that's in place, and we need to adjust ourselves because each time when there's a leadership change, you know that there's a certain leadership style, governance and management, also their own aspiration and priorities that affects us. So the civil service needs to support the leadership. The second, I think, challenge that I faced with regards to the education system itself, because when I came into position, 2020 is the end of wave 2 of the Malaysia Education Blueprint. So in my inaugural speech, I stressed on how far have we progressed, along the 2 waves of the Malaysia Education Blueprint. What are the strengths and challenges that we have faced, and how do we move forward? Because 2021 already marks the wave 3, and we have 5 years left up to 2025. Which is the end of the blueprint, and how far we have reached our aspirations then. So 2020 is a very crucial moment, because we have to make sure the aspirations our journey is on track, because we have committed to the Malaysia Education Blueprint. Thus, my focus was on delivery and ensuring the aspirations of the Malaysia Education Blueprint can be realized. I targeted on students, teachers, as well as school leaders. It doesn't mean that other components of the education system are not important, but when we assess or judge how successful an education system is, we need to see on the outcome, particularly outcome of the students. Thus, the most important are the students themselves and the school-based factors that influences the success of the performance of the students. Thus, my focus was on students, teachers, and school leaders, and I focused on 4 focus areas, which is on student participation, increase in their enrollment at all levels. When we do have our students enroll, then what electives, what are their choices, and how are we catering for them. So I would like to see a lot more increase in the number of students participating in STEM as well as TVET at that time, as well as greater access to students with special needs and the Orang Asli or indigenous community. When students access education, we need them to learn. So student learning is important for me. What is the future-proof knowledge and skills that we are providing them? The digital learning that is becoming even more important now and in the future, as well as the proficiency in English. Of course, the school-based factors that are most important are the teachers in particular, as well as the school leadership. We need them to be of quality in order to deliver these key aspirations. Of course, with the support of everyone in the system, in particular the JPN as well as the PPD. The other important component for me is the assessment. School-based assessment is becoming even more important. So how do we then improve and strengthen our school-based assessment? How do we better use the assessment data so that we can improve teaching and learning? And to ensure our students, when they attend school, they leave with at least a minimum mastery level. The third challenge is that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, when we had the first case in January 2020, we were unfamiliar and uncertain with the situation. Nobody would have expected the scale and intensity of the outbreak. The rapid rise in the number of positive cases in March forced the government to close many sectors, including education, thus putting many programs that we have planned at the beginning of the year to a halt. Malaysia was among the earliest in Southeast Asia to impose a nationwide movement control order, or MCO, on the 18th of March 2020. After the MCO was imposed, our stringency index rose from around 36 to 76. So this stringency index is a composite from 0 to 100. 100 is the strictest. So ours was quite strict. It was at 76 on the index. Schools were ordered to close during MCO and CMCO as well. Now, the scale of COVID-19 on the education system was huge, affecting more than 5 million students, more than 10,000 schools, as well as more than 440,000 teachers. So we acknowledge that the closure of schools reduced the likelihood of COVID-19 infection among our students as well as the school community, thus ensuring their safety and health. Nonetheless, it would most likely cause a huge loss of learning, which would eventually lead to disengagement, especially among those at risk of dropping out and the vulnerable groups. The Ministry of Education had taken immediate steps in order to address the challenges to ensure learning can continue to take place. So while MCO was announced last year, was first announced, we had several waves, but when it was first announced in March last year, it was the school holiday. So within the 2 weeks of MCO, school holiday continued. But when MCO was extended, the ministry sent out a circular requesting our teachers to carry out home-based learning or remote learning based on accessibility of devices as well as the suitability between teachers and students in order to do this home-based learning or remote learning. At that time, things were so uncertain and so unfamiliar, not just about the COVID-19 situation, but also on how we can make sure learning continues. We didn't know how long the pandemic would continue, but what we are certain is that learning has to continue regardless whether we can bring students back to school for face-to-face learning or it has to be done remotely. Later, when we understood the situation more and looked at the experiences on the ground, the ministry came out with a manual, we call it manual PDPR, pengajaran dan pembelajaran di rumah. And we focus on three main modes of remote learning. One is on online or digital, where we already launched the digital platform Dalima, Digital Educational Learning Initiative Malaysia. It was a timely launch. It was mooted in 2019, but we launched it in 2020. So Dalima not just provides the platform, it has on it various applications, including Google Classroom, that can allow our students as well as teachers to do teaching and learning. Videos such as EduWeb TV, Cikgu Tube, eGuru, quizzes, as well as games. Nevertheless, we need to understand the situation in that not all our students and teachers may have access to such devices as well as connectivity in order to do online learning. Thus, we also have non-digital or offline learning where we reintroduce TV pendidikan, education TV programs based on terrestrial free-to-all TV, which was available from 6th of April 2020. We began with one channel, 2 hours per day, and up to the end of the year, we had 3 channels, a total of 11 hours a day. And come 2021, on 17th of February, we launched Didik TV KPM, which is a dedicated channel for educational TV programs that runs from 7 a.m. to 12 a.m. daily. Other than that, we also have delivery of materials to student homes or close to their homes where they can access those learning materials or modules. Teachers in cooperation with District Health Office sent materials to students, especially those in remote areas as well as the indigenous communities where access is more difficult. We also have schools that provide drive-through pickups where parents could drive to the school compound or designated areas to pick up or send materials. We also have on-site remote learning where it doesn't happen in school but closer to the community when it is permissible for those places to operate. However, it's not just when schools are closed that we face the challenge for learning to continue to happen, but when the situation becomes slightly better, number of cases of positive cases are reduced, how do we then open up schools so that face-to-face or classroom learning can happen? We did a lot of consultations with stakeholders. We received advice from MKN as well as KKM and even the cabinet because it is such an important or key decision, because while we want to ensure learning happens, we also have to ensure safety and health. So we have guidelines on how we reopen schools, and subsequently when we have reopened schools, we also have revisions of that guideline on how to manage as well as operationalize schools in this new normal. The guidelines contain a lot of preventive measures, example on screening students before they enter schools, such as temperature, on physical distancing, throughout school and throughout the operations of the school, whether in the classroom, how do we manage lunch hour, how do we manage when schools enter as well as exit the schools, what is the model of schooling, because for those that can remain single session, they can continue to operate single session but with a greater physical distancing. But if they can't, then they need to operate as double session. But for those schools that are already double session, if they can continue operating double session, that's fine. But if they can't, then we have to think of a different method on a rotational basis on how students can still continue to attend school and learning continues. How do we manage and operate our hostels, our preschool, our children in special education needs classrooms? So all those are within this guideline that we have crafted. The role of parents and communities became more important in supporting schools and their children's learning. For instance, in the preparation for reopening of schools or operations of schools, making sure their children are healthy and safe, because schools are not the areas or spaces where we have the COVID-19 where it starts, but it comes from the outside. Thus, for our children as well as the teachers, they need to be healthy before they attend or they come to school. Also, regardless, other than this, there may have been certain gaps when students do not attend school. So when they do come back to school, physical schooling, I mean, so how do we make sure that we can cover the curriculum within the shortened period of face-to-face learning? So that is also an important consideration at that time. Nevertheless, what are some of the costs? How COVID-19 had widened the learning gap? For the whole year of 2020, we had 150 days of face-to-face learning and 48 days of home-based learning. Even that 150, we managed that because we shortened, for instance, school holidays, and we stretched to as far as possible on the learning when we can open or reopen schools. So the 150 days is the maximum number of days that schools can achieve in delivering face-to-face instructions. The number of days of face-to-face schooling are lower in many states because of the imposed MCO was longer in some states like in Sabah as well as in Selangor. Now, we also had some trade-offs when we did home-based learning. Firstly, I would think is the readiness of our students, teachers, as well as parents to switch from face-to-face to home-based learning. So that was a test to many. We even started with asking our teachers on how well, because they know their students better than us within the ministry then. How can they reach out to their students to continue that learning? So it's even a bigger challenge for the younger students. How do we manage preschools or even those in the early primary level to do home-based learning? While the manual was developed to assist teachers as well as parents, the manual is like a guideline to be referred to, but it's not a one-size solution for all. It has to be adjusted. Teachers, school community needs to take into account the different context of their situation in order to do this home-based learning effectively. And much of the curricula cannot be adapted quickly to home-based learning as the curriculum is complex. It's not just a matter of the cognitive content, but we know that our philosophy is more on Jerry, the physical, emotional, the spiritual. How do we do all this through home-based or remote learning? And the sudden move might also create learning gap, especially among students due to the variances in the instructional quality in terms of the reach out time. An early study by EPRD showed that teachers indicated that during this home-based or remote learning, they could cover between 40 to 80% of what they would have covered if they were in school. So 80% is quite good, I would think, in terms of the coverage. But if the percentage covered is much less, then how do we then cover or reduce the learning gap within those days where we could not do face-to-face learning? Now, I did mention on the gap in terms of ownership of devices as well as connectivity. So we have within between 2 to 10% of ownership depending on the type of device, whether it's a PC, tablet or laptop. Most when they do have devices, it's in the form of handphone, up to 34 to 48%. 35 to 36% of students do not own any type of device at all. So more than 1/3 of our students do not have devices for any online or digital learning. So this needs to be taken into account when teachers need to manage the home-based or remote learning. Now, other than that, in terms of assessment, the SPM itself, for instance, we had to postpone from the original date as many as 3 times before it eventually happened. The UPSR 2020 had to be cancelled, as well as the PT3 2020 had to be cancelled as well. And as we know, in 2021, UPSR is totally taken off, while the PT3 has been cancelled again for 2021. So at that point of time, we used, for instance, UPSR for as part of the selection criteria into selected or specific schools, as well as PT3. So we had to adopt or to come up with a different method of selection, and we called it Pentaksiran Khusus Sekolah Khas or PKSK, in order to select students after primary to go into these specific schools, or after Form 3 to go into specific schools. In terms of literacy and numeracy, students' foundational literacy and numeracy skills, especially those at the lower primary level, would most likely be affected, because how much can you cover through home-based or remote learning? While we do receive the support of parents when students are at home, but then again, parents moderate or help to facilitate or motivate their children to continue learning. How effective compared to the teacher moderating it face to face? That is a question. Coping with specific needs. So there's a huge likelihood that the number of out-of-school days for students with special needs would deprive them of the expert support, as well as specific learning tools available to them in schools. However, we do have certain learning tools that were made available to them to use at home. But then it's not a matter of the tools, you also need to have the expert support as well. So as a leader, reassessment of the situation was important. Also, the adaptability to the needs of the system. So I started with the saying that during my inaugural speech on my focus on how we can move forward with the Malaysia education blueprint. So with the sudden disruption of schooling, the ministry had to re-evaluate its goals, especially in providing access to education, particularly to learning in the short as well as medium term, so that we can achieve what we have set out. So in terms of access, we need to see that students have access to education and learning via multiple platforms at home when schools cannot open. In terms of quality, teachers with the support of parents are able to maintain as well as deliver quality lessons, again via multiple platforms. And teachers are equipped with the knowledge to deliver home-based learning to students. Because teachers, definitely, we are asking a lot of them, and are they well equipped to do that? Equity, so the delivery of educational content on various platforms have to reach students, especially via different, they have different access to technology. So how do we then narrow the gap in terms of these differences? While we do remote learning, how do we ensure that online platforms or the multiple platforms that we use would promote interaction among students of different races? Because unity is one of our important aspiration in education. And how do we maximize the use of these various platforms, including the digital learning platforms, communication technologies, and terrestrial television in delivering the educational contents. So ensuring that decision was made collectively and the outcomes of decisions were disseminated to stakeholders effectively is very important. So adhering to the chain of command at the start of the pandemic crisis, when things were, as I said, very unfamiliar and uncertain, the organization for the response was centralized. This is seen in two ways. First, decisions about different sectors, including education, were centralized under the National Security Council. Example, the implementation of MCO, the closing and reopening of sectors. Second is centralization, where the decisions and activities in education were centralized at the national level under the Ministry of Education with advice from NSC, Ministry of Health, and MKN. This ensured a highly coordinated and integrated approach to the response, with all key decisions taken under a single umbrella. Nevertheless, the ministry empowered certain decisions to the ground, especially in the day-to-day operations of the school and learning, but we also provided clear and transparent SOPs, as well as at certain times they are scripted as well. Secondly, stakeholders must be updated constantly. The ministry would ensure that the decisions made at the highest level were disseminated to the relevant stakeholders, including parents, teachers, students. So social media played an effective role in updating the public with key decisions made by the ministry. We also had to focus on clear and effective communication, where frequent updates and transparency had to be maintained. Leaders need to be clear on what they know, what they don't know, and what we are doing in terms of to learn more of the situation and how we manage things. So thoughtful, frequent communication shows that leaders are following the situation and adjusting their response as they learn more is important for public to know, because this would help reassure stakeholders that they are confronting the crisis. So leaders should take special care to see that each audience's concerns, questions, and interests are addressed. So weekly or more frequently at the start when we face these critical issues, sometimes daily engagement meetings with various people, various division heads and state education directors became effective in communicating and updating key decisions, as well as getting first-hand feedback of what is happening at each level. Also having high-level figureheads such as the minister, top management speak firsthand were also effective to indicate that leaders are managing the crisis. Nevertheless, when we have more than one people speaking, we need to speak in one voice, because we do not want confusion happening when there are a lot of people speaking on the topic. So what leaders need to learn in crisis are behaviors and mindsets that will help them look ahead. Perhaps one of the important one is the ability to be flexible and adaptable to various situational crises. So in a crisis, leaders face problems that are unfamiliar and poorly understood. The ministry relied on a command and control structure to manage operations well, by carrying out scripted response at times. So this is to ensure stability. The trade-off is that we may not know the exact situation on the ground, lack of information, contextual information. So schools and the might not be able to adhere to the guidelines put forth by the ministry. So we need to test out those guidelines. We must allow schools to adapt within the boundaries of the guidelines. So that's an important consideration, although we do have SOPs, guidelines, scripts that they need to follow, but then again, we should also allow flexibility and adaptability within the boundaries. Empowerment is necessary. As we progress, some empowerment were given to the grassroots to make decisions quickly enough to respond effectively. This was accompanied by clear SOPs to ensure clear line of authority and implementation. Even with SOPs, there is also room for flexibility, as I mentioned, and decision making at the grassroots level. So, for example, safety and security at the school level, while we relied a lot on the pejabat kesihatan daerah to advise us when there are positive cases in school, but then again, as the numbers of cases increased and pejabat kesihatan daerah had their hands full, how do we manage the situation in school? Thus, to enable contact tracing and so on to happen, we allowed schools through the State Education Office to close schools for 7 days when there is a positive case within the school. But then again, when the situation became better, we had to lift or remove this empowerment given because we then allowed the Pejabat Kesihatan Daerah again to provide the necessary advice on how to handle schools. So, empowerment may be also operating at certain times, but it can also be removed or become even strict at other times. So again, between ability to be flexible and adaptable goes in hand with the empowerment that's given during the crisis. But also important is empathy, because school closure puts strain on working parents, for instance, or even when parents are not working, it has certain strains. So since the crisis affects people in particular ways, leaders should pay careful attention to how people are struggling and take corresponding measures to support them. For example, the opening of Taska, especially for parents who are working, teachers who need to do work at home even though schools are open. For instance, teachers who are more at risk, teachers who are less resilient to certain infection, teachers who have very young children, or teachers who have children with special education needs. So we need to be more flexible to them, but it cannot be an excuse, when schools are open. So engagement to understand the situation and to hear the voices, different voices on the relevant issues is paramount at that time. So whilst COVID-19 had disrupted the system, successes in overcoming the challenges were also visible. For example, there were increase in terms of usage of online learning platform. So when compared to when we started at the early part of the year, and when we had the COVID situation and more online learning had to happen, the number of the Lima users increased by more than 60% by November 2020 as compared to January of 2020. Key examinations, including SPM, SVM, STPM, and STAM, were carried out successfully, even though we were facing the crisis. So while we could do away, for instance, with UPSR and PT3 and not having them in 2020 and even in 2021, but these examinations at the end of upper secondary or post-secondary level is important for further education or for entering the world of work. So we had to conduct the SPM, for instance. We postponed up to 22nd of February to 25th of March 2021 for the SPM 2020, involving more than 400,000 candidates at 3,310 centers. So we had more than 48,000 pengawas, invigilators. We had more than 24,000 markers, exam markers. And we also had to conduct a second sitting for the SPM to cater for slightly less than 3,000 candidates who were under quarantine, who were facing positive COVID-19 during the first sitting. Nevertheless, this figure is only 0.74% of the whole SPM 2020 population. So for me, it's a great success by the Ministry of Education then. And we also introduced online marking in order to improve the efficiency and to make sure that the papers are marked on time. We do not want to jeopardize the entry into tertiary education or into the world of work. So this online marking reduced the duration as compared to the usual way of marking those papers. So 82 out of 83 of the SPM papers were marked online. So this is the first time that we introduce this system on such a big scale. The continuous support to teaching and learning, realignment of the curriculum was carried out. So what was the core that has to be stressed? What's the value add, as well as the pelengkap to the curriculum, so that teachers can manage the content of the curriculum better. Increased number of online webinars as well as courses to support home-based learning. So last year, when we looked at professional development and the training of our teachers, the target was closely matched with what we began at the beginning part of the year, because most of those courses were carried out either through remotely or through online methods. So what have been some of the key considerations and lessons learned during the crisis? I think clear policy to ensure that new or any policies derived from the crisis benefiting students, especially in their learning process. Clear and effective communication plans to ensure key stakeholders receive clear and up-to-date information from the ministry. Inclusion and equity to reflect on social and economic gaps, digital divide, and the delivery systems to the intended recipients. Social and emotional support. It's very stressful on parents, on students, even teachers themselves. Thus, social and emotional support is paramount. Assessment to further enhance formative assessment and school-based assessments. Participatory approach, the importance of multi-sectoral approaches to response, recovery, and resilience. I think resilience or grit is most important to stick through, even though we are in this crisis. However, while we were handling a lot of short-term, how do we handle the day-to-day crisis? But then again, for the education system, I think we need to have a longer view of how we manage learning and the system as well. Because it looks like the COVID-19 situation will not go away quickly. It will remain, and some of the changes that are happening now will stay. It may not be in the same magnitude, it may be reduced, or it may become even more magnified. So for instance, the COVID-19 crisis has changed how we live, work, and learn in many ways that will alter our behavior even after the pandemic. It has accelerated trends that were unfolding before, but at a much slower pace then. So the crisis has accelerated those trends, and it will persist after the pandemic. So evidences from various studies, such as from McKinsey Global Institute on the future of work after COVID-19, indicates three broad sets of trends affecting the future of work: remote work, e-commerce, and automation. So the crisis has permanently changed workplace conditions and skill set needs, and how we can prepare for this future. So for example, digitization accelerated faster than imagined possible. For education, the pandemic's uneven impact on student learning threatens to widen inequality, while at the same time delivering rapid developments in digital education and digital fluency. So our policy makers need to seize this opportunity to address emerging gaps and provide the necessary policy, the content, training, infrastructure for digital education. So one of the key challenges that would be more pronounced is how do we develop the curriculum. So now the curriculum here is not just the document or the documentation, the written curriculum, but also the taught curriculum, the pedagogy, the technology that goes with it, as well as the assessed curriculum. So curriculum, you know, for many of us, it's the document, standard curriculum, but curriculum actually is the main ingredient of the education system, because what is learned and what students achieve is defined by the curriculum. The process is defined by the curriculum. What support, what technologies is used is defined by the curriculum. So the dynamics of the labor market have changed drastically since the advent of digital technology and the fourth industrial revolution. So there's rapid as well as wide diffusion of emerging technologies, which is transforming how tasks or jobs are carried out and creating new roles for humans and displacing as well humans. So this requires different skills as well as competencies. So at the same time, we see growing evidence of mismatch between the skills required for current as well as future workforce and the skills of current employees, including recent graduates from various education institutions, including schools and universities. So this 21st century gap is costly. Thus, key challenge for us is in developing the curriculum to ensure that it would provide the necessary skills from the workforce. So this we already see even prior to COVID-19, but the COVID-19 has also put in certain trends. So these have to be taken into account when we do design or develop our curriculum. So the current trends suggest the curriculum taught in schools would be the best step in equipping our students with the necessary skills rather than having those in the workforce to be reskilled in new emergent skills. So while we need to perhaps reskill those people who are already in the workforce, but it is of great efficiency if our curriculum itself can be used to equip our students with the necessary skills rather than having them reskilled in the workforce. So the curriculum must provide students with broader set of 21st century skills. So evidences have shown that soft skills are important, but at the same time, hard skills, the majority of those essential are technology related. And these changes require our education systems to empower children and youth with different skills and competencies. So while it's important that we handle this COVID-19 situation well, students continue to learn, but then again, we need to reassess, and I've laid out what were some of the considerations when I was the DG then. But then again, after more than a year, after more than almost 1.5 years, we need to reassess again, how are we handling the situation? While we need to focus on how we are handling learning in the short term, but in the long term, there are emerging trends and new or more stressed on certain skills and competencies that we need to handle within the education system. this is the juncture, I think, that we need to clearly see how we are moving forward. Not just handling the immediate, but how do we successfully handle in the long term. So despite the pandemic, achieving the bold aspirations of the education system is still pivotal. And to do this, it requires the support of various people. Education, as we know, is no longer within the walls of the classroom. While we do talk about remote learning and home-based learning, it also not just between the teachers and students, but it requires parents and community to play their role in the learning. While we talk about the school system, we are not talking about the learning ecosystem. So I think before I end, there was a question on what areas of study that we need to focus on, because to me there's still a lot of uncertainty, and we need to understand the situation more in order for us to move forward based on evidences. While we speak about PDPR, home-based learning or remote learning, we know about the gadgets or no gadget, no connectivity, no connectivity. But then again, we know that learning happens, but how effective is the learning that happens through this home-based or remote learning? And when children do come back to schools, how effective are the schools handling the learning gaps or what has been missed at the various levels, whether it's at the early stage of schooling or at the higher stage of learning. So this is an area where I think the academic researchers, teachers can focus on how we can improve effectiveness of the teaching and learning during this crisis. On empowerment, how well do policies translate to the delivery on the ground? How well do our leaders and teachers use the empowerment given to them? Because the powers or the authority given is just as good as how well are you using the empowerment or the authority given. There's no point in empowering and giving the powers or authority, but we do not know on how to use it. So how effective has this been? How do our leaders at school or at the district or at the state level manage during the crisis? How has I think we need to acknowledge that we do have performance gaps, but how has the performance gap been managed during the crisis? Either rural, urban, gender, SES, or even between groups of children. It's not just the cognitive, but how has Jerry been translated during this pandemic or crisis? So I think those are some areas where it is most pertinent that we have a better idea or evidence of what is happening. So I will stop here for now.
Thank you, Datuk, so much for the inspiring and very informative information. If I can conclude a little bit on what Datuk has mentioned in lecture just now. So it seems that Datuk, you had a never-ending challenge during your term as the general education general, sorry. And we can see that the challenges is not just the COVID-19. You also had challenges in terms of ensuring the implementation of the Malaysian education blueprint, challenges in the political landscape, because of the changes. You had 4 ministers of education, 2 prime ministers and ruling at that time. And then also, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic, which led to the closure of schools, uncertainties, changes, constant changes, which have led to various challenges that you had to endure. But nevertheless, we could see that various efforts have been initiated in the Ministry of Education, in which home-based learning or remote learning happened. Most teachers, obviously, at that time, unfortunately, were not ready for the PDPR. But we can see that the gradual changes and also the gradual improvement in terms of readiness of both teachers, parents, and students as well. But obviously, there's still a lot of things that can be improved. We can see that the Ministry of Education acted very fast, and in which they had the digital remote learning, the Lima Google Classroom, the education TV program, Didik TV, which is dedicated channel, is a dedicated channel for education program. But nevertheless, you can see that as you said, there's a lot of uncertainties in which this is a very unprecedented event or situation that we are facing at the moment. But nevertheless, this pandemic is something which is not going to go away very soon, and we need to adapt and learn to live with the virus. Obviously, permanent changes have happened to us, all of us, and we just need to be proactive and be prepared for the future, and we need to plan well in order to overcome whatever challenges that we are facing. Right. It's very interesting to see how you manage to plan and overcome those challenges that you faced. My personal question to you, Dato, on your part as a leader, how did you equip yourself to face those challenges?
How do I equip myself?
Yeah,
I
how did you do it personally at personal level? You can see that you've done so much at the Ministry of Education level, and you have coordinated so many things that happen. But how did you manage to do it at the personal level for you to be able to do all those things?
I think the first that comes to my mind is the experience that we build up throughout the years is important. So while you and I may have our PhDs, but like for me, my experience through the PhD process enables me to think more objectively, but it doesn't mean that I use in particular the cognitive or the content of it itself. Because my specialization was on international and comparative education. But being the Director General, to look at things comparatively is only a component of the things that I see. For instance, even on the COVID-19 situation, you need to see how other countries are also handling the situation. That's where, you know, my international and comparative background comes into play. But then again, I do have 34 years of experience in the system. So that experience helps to develop and enable me perhaps to give certain considerations on decisions that have to be made. But it's difficult in the sense that this situation is one that we have never seen or handled before, even though I have 34 years of experience. So things are so uncertain. So a lot of engagements had to be made because we need to hear voices from the ground, what people are thinking. We need to get advice from those with authority on the situation, like on security, it would be MKN, on health, it would be Ministry of Health, on transport, how do we bus our children or those students that are using public transport, we have to then ask the Ministry of Transport. So all this, we learn daily. I think Dean said during the COVID-19 situation, we had to learn and adapt as we move along. So I think, which is true. In fact, I think I work even harder during the COVID-19 situation. Yeah, because you have to sit down and really see it. And we cannot simply make decisions based on assumptions without backups because it will affect a lot of people within the education system. And we cannot make, decisions that will have negative responses. We have to manage it well. So those kind of engagements are important. And it's not just on our external stakeholders, but also within the ministry itself. We need to have those various engagements. Because definitely if the ministry makes those decisions, the ones that will carry it out are the JPN district as well as the schools themselves. So if it's poorly understood, if it is not feasible to be done at those various levels, still we will not be able to handle it well. So I think the handling of the SPM, for instance, is well done because we did not have any positive case at our 3,310 centers because we did the screening, we increased the distance between our tables. We also isolated for those children that are having certain symptoms. They are not positive, but they have certain symptoms, and we are worried if we put them together with the others, it may affect the others if they later show positive signs. So we isolate them, but still they are able to take the exam. So those kind of considerations, you need to really think it out, frame it on how you can handle certain situations. So I think that was what happened during my tenure.
Okay, thank you, Datuk. So really requires that your experience. Your experience really helped a lot, and also to keep you composed and also to make decisions. So there's a lot of factors that we need to consider when we're taking any decisions. Right, Datuk, we have questions from the audience. Assalam Datuk, what are your expectations of the SPM and STPM 2020 results before the results are announced in our face of this COVID-19 pandemic? So what were your expectations of the results before it was announced?
I think my expectations are no longer important. They have the results and it shows. But before, when we wanted to conduct this key or very important examinations, our worry was one, whether students are ready, Other than the health and safety, considerations that we need to handle when we do conduct the exam, but the students themselves, whether they are ready or not to take the exam. Because for this SPM 2020, year 2020 was so disruptive for them. So that's why in 2021, when we could not open schools to everyone, our topmost priority was to bring back the SPM 2020 cohort, at least. Whilst the time may not be long, it's short, but then that would be, to put them back to gear in terms of getting them ready. Getting ready for an exam is not just in terms of what the content or what is going to be examined, but also their motivation level, their psychology, whether they are fit to take those exams and can perform the best that they can. But I'm happy to see I did manage to go down to certain states and at various centers to see how the exam was carried out and spoke to some of those students, and many of them are confident. And even prior to that as well, when I asked them how ready are they, so perhaps the time given for them to do their own self-learning, as well as supported by their teachers as well as their parents at home, perhaps help them to sit and perform during the exam. But I think when many people ask me about this, that's my worry, for them to sit for the exam. But now that they have sat for the exam and we know of the result that has been released, we need to understand more on how this happened. If we see the grade prorata grade point average improved. We see the number of passes increased so much within the 5 years of SPM. So we need to understand what actually contributed to that level of performance. So the analysis needs to be done, and this is important to be done quickly because some of the things that we learn can be used to support those students that will be taking SPM 2021 and onwards if this COVID situation persists. How has it impacted the students? So we know there has been a narrowing of the urban-rural gap, but do we know how it has affected those students at various socio-economic status levels? Who has been most affected? If they have not been affected, even those students that are among the B40 has been successful in performing in the exam, how did they manage so that kind of management can also be used to support SPM 2021 cohort? Despite the disadvantages, how did our students overcome them? How did our teachers manage the situation well? So I think there's no point in dwelling upon, whether the results is true, false, and so on and so forth. I'm more interested in doing that analysis and understanding the situation so that we can move forward and support our students and teachers better.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Datuk. I think what is more important is the student learning and their welfare rather than we debating on the results, because without hard evidence, as you said, we cannot actually say anything with confidence or with clarity because we don't have the facts. Okay, another question, Datuk. These 10 listed skills companies are quite difficult for our teachers and students. What is the best method for teachers to gain quick knowledge from learning or finding the method themselves? Can you get the question, Datuk?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what it is asking. What is the best method for teachers to gain quick knowledge from learning or finding the method themselves?
Self-learning, I think.
Okay. I think before I answer this, moving ahead, I thought that certain knowledge, skills, and competencies are becoming more important now, looking at the trends as well as what is required for the future workforce. And I am not sure whether our curriculum is able to provide those necessary knowledge, skills, and competencies, especially when we are doing it remotely. Even with the current curriculum, I believe it's difficult for teachers to handle. They, at best, we may deliver the content and certain skills through certain kind of activities that we do with the students, for instance, project work and so on and so forth. But certain skills are difficult to transfer through home-based learning or remote learning. So what will be the future impact of these students when later on, whether they continue higher education and then enter the workforce? So what would be the future impact of it? So that's of importance to me and what I'm always thinking about. How do we manage the curriculum? As I say, the curriculum is more than just the standards, but how do we do the pedagogy? How do we use the technologies and how do we assess better whether school-based or whether it's a centralized exam? But then important is, like the question said, the teachers themselves. We are asking a lot of our teachers. Last year, many of our teachers were grappling with online learning, for instance, because not everyone is conversant to do online or digital learning. But as we see, the graph shows an improvement, an increase in the use of the lemma because they learn. But the question is saying, how do we make learning faster? So it depends on the motivation level of the teachers themselves. You know, when we have seen many teachers, even during the year, the use of the dilemma spiked immediately upon the MCO, and definitely on the second wave of MCO, it really increased further. So I think our teachers are already learning. And before I left, when I looked at the professional development plan for our teachers, a lot is very focused on technologies. How does teaching and learning happen through technology, the use of the technologies itself. So I think the ministry has already considered that the COVID is here to stay for some time. And even in the new normal, technologies are getting important and it will stay. So it's not a waste. So some of the questions people have asked me before is, okay, we provide laptops, notebook, and so on and so forth. What will happen after COVID-19? Hybrid blended learning is so important, and learning doesn't just happen in school. It also happens outside of school,
Yes.
even when
Okay.
schools open. And there's a lot of information and knowledge through digital that we need to, grapple. So I think back to that question, I think teachers need to have that motivation. We used to talk about lifelong learning.
Yes, exactly.
So this is part and parcel of the concept of lifelong learning. Learning needs to happen, and especially if you want, as she said, fast learning, we just need to grab it and take it on board. That should be how we see things. It cannot be delayed. We have to be flexible. We have to be adaptable, and most importantly, we have to be resilient to stick through and make sure it happens.
Yes, Datuk. So obviously, passion is a very important thing to have in a teacher so that they would be motivated to find ways to help the students, whatever means. For example, students from remote areas, they can't get access to digital technology. The extra efforts should be done to find ways to get the learning materials for them, like you've mentioned in your lecture. Right. I think that's about it for the questions. We don't have any other questions, Dato. So I think we can end this session. Thank you so much for the very informative lecture and all the efforts that you have
Thank you.
spearheaded in facing the challenges. And for your jasa and khidmat bakti, not just as the former Education Director General for the Ministry of Education, but also dearly to us as our adjunct professor at FSSH. Let us all pray for the pandemic to end soon. Inshallah, we never know. Is God willing. Nevertheless, permanent changes have occurred in our lives, and life has to go on. We have to manage to adapt and learn to do better. Inshallah. Okay, happy retirement, Dato, and take care. Stay safe.
Thank you so
Inshallah,
much.
God willing, we will meet again in the future. Thank you so much, and Assalamualaikum. Back to you, Dr. Rostam. Thank you.
Thank you, Associate Professor Dr. Azlina and Yang Berbahagia Dr. Habibah Abdul Rahim. I think that was a very nice and fruitful sharing, and I believe that all of us gained a lot of insight on the topic shared. As I can see many good comments and feedback in the Facebook chat. If I could read some of the comments from Abdul Mumini Indah. This is impactful and helpful. Thank you so much for your continuous encouragement and enlightenment. And maybe another one comment from Liza Haji Ali. She said an outstanding and clear thinking behind the planning. Yes, I do agree. Thank you so much, Dato. Thank you so much, Ministry of Education. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to invite all of you to our next FSSH Adjunct Professor Lecture Series 14, which will be delivered by Dato Frida Muhammad Pilus on the topic Development of Primary and Secondary School Students. and the program will be held on 11 July at 10 a.m. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, now we are at the end of the event. Again, thanks for all your questions, feedback, participations, and support. We are truly appreciate it. And again, I thank everyone. Thank you for watching. Until we meet again, Assalamualaikum. Great day. Bye-bye.